In the winter of 1981, the CIA's Moscow station received an anonymous signal that would later be remembered as one of the most crucial and one of the most tragically delayed warnings of the Cold War. The message did not come through the usual channels. There was no coded telegram, no intercepted radio burst, no tip from a known asset. Instead, it was a handwritten note slipped into the mailbox of the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. It contained only one sentence: "Your house is already open." At first, the CIA officers dismissed it as another attempt by Soviet counterintelligence to induce paranoia. The KGB had long mastered psychological warfare. For years, both sides played the same brutal game, spreading misinformation, creating false leads, and trying to break the other's focus. But this note was different. Its handwriting had been distorted, and the paper bore no fingerprints. It was the kind of silent alarm used only by assets in extreme danger. Inside the embassy, a quiet debate erupted. The chief of station, an experienced officer named Robert Fulton, insisted that the message should be treated seriously. Fulton had been in Moscow long enough to understand the KGB's rhythm. He knew that when the Soviets wanted to mislead, they overwhelmed the CIA with noise, radio chatter, stage tailing, fake defectors. But this message was not noise. It was the absence of it. Pure, simple, and terrifying. What the CIA did not know was that, at that very moment, the KGB had already completed one of the most sophisticated counterintelligence operations ever attempted. A deep penetration of the U.S. communications system in Moscow, something they had been building for nearly 6 years. In the late 1970s, the KGB's second chief directorate began a project internally referred to as Chistota, Operation Cleanliness. The plan was simple in concept but monumental in execution: to compromise the embassy by installing surveillance devices not just inside the building, but inside the systems the CIA believed were safest, their encrypted communication lines. For years, the CIA had relied on a system called the KL7, an aging encryption machine that both sides knew was reaching the end of its life. The CIA assumed the KGB lacked the capability or the opportunity to breach such a system. But this was a dangerous assumption, one that would cost them dearly. By late 1980, Soviet technicians working under the guise of routine maintenance crews had already gained controlled access to several key infrastructure points around the embassy. The CIA noticed the increased Soviet activity, but because the embassy itself had not been breached, they believed they were safe. They weren't. Meanwhile, inside the KGB, an officer by the name of Oleg Gordievsky quietly watched the progress of Operation Cleanliness. Gordievsky disagreed with much of what the KGB was doing. Secretly, he had begun feeding the British MI6 classified information, but even he did not know the full scale of the operation, being carried out just meters from where he worked. The warning note arrived only after the final stage had been completed. When the CIA finally ran a full sweep of their internal systems, reluctantly, and only after Fulton's insistence, the discovery shocked even the most experienced officers. The breach was not on the embassy floor, it was below it. Someone had tapped into the underground communication conduits, the very arteries of CIA operations. And the worst part? The KGB had been listening for months, maybe years. The CIA realized for the first time that they were not simply behind, they were finished. The mission they had been preparing for was doomed before it even began. The CIA's investigation into the breach forced them to confront a possibility they had long avoided. The KGB had infiltrated the embassy before the first American officer even stepped inside. The building, completed in the late 1970s, had been constructed almost entirely with Soviet labor. Even then, Washington suspected foul play, but the demands of diplomacy and the costs of delay forced them to proceed. Now, in 1981, the consequences of that decision were becoming painfully clear. During the sweep of the underground conduits, CIA technicians discovered a cable junction box that did not match the original American schematics. It looked identical on the outside. Same paint, same metal, same screws, everything perfectly replicated. But inside, it held something the CIA had feared for decades: a passive resonant cavity bug. No wires, no batteries, no signature. Just a tiny metallic chamber engineered to vibrate when hit by specific microwave frequencies. It was a modern successor to the famous Great Seal bug, which the Soviets had once hidden inside a wooden plaque given as a gift to the U.S. ambassador in 1945. But this new device was smaller, more stable, and nearly impossible to detect without dismantling the entire communication system. When the internal report reached Langley, the CIA's Office of Security responded with urgency. They dispatched a specialized counterintelligence team to Moscow, a rare move, as the KGB monitored every flight from Washington and immediately tracked all American experts entering the country. But the agency had no choice. If the embassy's encrypted communications were compromised, then every operation launched from Moscow in the past decade was now in question. Meanwhile, the KGB was already celebrating. Operation Cleanliness had exceeded expectations. Not only had they managed to slip a passive bug into the embassy's communication arteries, they had done so without a single alarm being triggered. The KGB second chief directorate viewed the operation as a masterpiece of Soviet ingenuity. Inside Lubyanka, Colonel Viktor Chernyakovsky, one of the architects of the operation, briefed his superiors on the extent of the penetration. He explained that the device worked in tandem with a series of underground microwave transmitters, disguised as maintenance equipment. These transmitters activated the resonant cavity at intervals, capturing encrypted embassy traffic in real time. The Americans were still searching for physical evidence, unaware that the KGB had engineered a system that left almost no forensic trace. Even more troubling was the discovery that the breach extended far beyond the embassy walls. A second sweep revealed a series of disguised conduits leading toward a Soviet-controlled maintenance tunnel. The CIA realized the terrifying implication. The KGB had physically rerouted sections of the embassy's communication infrastructure decades earlier. This meant that nearly every classified message sent from the embassy, cables to Washington, agent reports, encrypted transmissions, had been susceptible to interception. The CIA's most carefully guarded intelligence pipeline had become a free-flowing source of information for the KGB. As the truth came into focus, one question grew louder. What operations had been compromised? Immediately, attention turned to one of the CIA's most sensitive Moscow missions, an initiative codenamed Operation Snowfield. For months, the CIA had been preparing to extract a high-ranking Soviet official who claimed he had information that could shift the balance of the Cold War. The operation had been delayed repeatedly due to concerns over surveillance, but now it appeared those delays had actually saved the informant's life. Because if the KGB had been listening for months, then they knew everything. The meeting points, the extraction route, even the code name of the officer the CIA planned to rescue. Suddenly, the message in the embassy mailbox, "Your house is already open," no longer seemed mysterious. Someone had tried to warn them, but the warning had come too late. Langley issued an emergency order. Operation Snowfield was to be halted immediately. But by then, the Soviets were already closing in on the informant, and the CIA had no idea just how far the KGB was willing to go to keep him silent. The man at the center of Operation Snowfield was known to the CIA by the codename ULYSSES. His real identity remained classified for decades, but later declassified files suggest he was a mid-ranking officer within the Soviet Ministry of Defense, someone with limited access to nuclear strategy, but unusually broad visibility into internal KGB operations. For months, ULYSSES had been feeding the CIA small, verifiable pieces of information. Nothing dramatic at first. Procurement delays, personnel reshuffles, whispers of new KGB training protocols. But in late 1980, he passed along something that made both Langley and the Moscow station sit up straight. Evidence that the KGB was attempting a long-term penetration of Western encrypted communication systems. The CIA initially dismissed it. They had heard similar rumors before. But ULYSSES insisted that this time, the operation was not theoretical. It was already underway. Now, in 1981, the breach in the Moscow embassy proved he had been telling the truth all along. When Langley ordered Operation Snowfield halted, the Moscow station tried desperately to send a warning to ULYSSES, but the CIA was in a trap. Every communication channel they had relied on for years was now compromised. Any message they sent would be intercepted instantly. Any dead drop they attempted to use would already be under surveillance. Agent Robert Fulton, the chief of station, considered the unthinkable, sending a courier on foot, without encryption, without cover, without protection. But even that was too risky. Moscow, in the early 1980s, was one of the most heavily monitored cities in the world. The KGB had informants everywhere, in the metro stations, in apartment courtyards, in hotel lobbies, even in the forests outside the city limits. Meanwhile, inside the KGB, the hunt had already begun. Colonel Viktor Chernyakovsky, still writing the victory of Operation Cleanliness, received a classified memorandum from the 5th Directorate. A suspected mole had been transmitting sensitive information to the Americans. The KGB did not yet know his identity, but they knew his pattern. He operated cautiously, communicated rarely, and only through prearranged signals. Such discipline suggested a trained insider. Ulysses had become a priority target. The KGB launched a methodical isolation, sweep, a technique that involved quietly monitoring every employee within the Ministry of Defense who had any access to intelligence. They mapped travel patterns, telephone usage, spending behavior, and suddenly altered routines. The system was slow but relentless. Once it locked onto a suspect, the KGB would tighten the net until escape became impossible. On January 12, 1981, an internal KGB analyst flagged a discrepancy in Ulysses's work schedule. He had been visiting a printing facility with unusual frequency, far beyond what his job required. That same facility, as it turned out, was located near one of the CIA's dead drop sites. It was enough to initiate surveillance. Within days, Ulysses noticed shadows trailing him, the same faces in different places, the same cars behind him on different roads. He realized the net was closing. In a final act of desperation, he attempted to send a message to the CIA using an improvised signal, placing a strip of white cloth on the balcony of an abandoned apartment block. The CIA saw it, but they did not understand it. By the time they decoded the meaning, "I am compromised," Ulysses had already vanished. Not arrested, not interrogated, not extracted, just gone. The KGB never announced an arrest. No trial, no internal memo. It was as if he had been erased. For years, intelligence analysts argued about what happened to him. Some believed he escaped on his own. Others believed he was taken to a black site. And a few suspected something far more alarming: that his disappearance was part of a larger KGB deception. But for the CIA, one thing was clear. The loss of Ulysses was not just a failed operation. It was a devastating blow to their entire Moscow program. And they were about to learn that the KGB was not finished. Operation Cleanliness was only the first stage. Another, far more dangerous move was already underway. In the aftermath of Ulysses's disappearance, Langley pushed the Moscow station to salvage whatever fragments of intelligence they could. With their communication lines compromised, with their informant gone, and with the KGB growing bolder by the day, the CIA made a desperate decision. They launched a new mission, one born out of panic, political pressure, and internal fear of losing all visibility inside the Soviet system. The operation was codenamed Midnight Sun. Its objective was not to extract anyone, not to infiltrate any facility, not to plant any device. Its purpose was far more primitive: to confirm whether the KGB's penetration of the embassy had extended into the CIA's field networks throughout Moscow. If the KGB had mapped the CIA's clandestine routes, their brush passes, safe houses, coded signals, surveillance evasion loops, then Moscow had become a graveyard for American assets. To test this, the CIA prepared a controlled decoy mission. A junior case officer, newly arrived from Langley, would perform a simulated dead drop. The drop contained nothing: no intelligence, no codes, no operational plans. It was bait. The idea was simple. If the KGB intervened quickly and efficiently, it would confirm that they had complete visibility into the CIA's procedures. Against Fulton's advice, Washington insisted on using the younger officer, Daniel Harper, only 32, ambitious, inexperienced, and unaware of just how dangerous the Moscow urban theater really was. Harper had trained for years in evasion, disguise, and counter-surveillance, but no amount of training could prepare him for the reality of a city where the enemy controlled every streetlight, every taxi, every custodian in every building. On the night of February 3, 1981, Harper entered the Moscow metro, carrying a small metal capsule identical to those used for intelligence drops. His instructions were precise: ride 3 stations, transfer lines twice, exit at Sokolniki Park, and hide the capsule inside a hollowed-out section of a weathered birch tree. 20 years later, declassified KGB files would confirm something chilling. The KGB knew the entire plan before Harper even left the embassy. Not from surveillance, not from a tail, not from informants. They had read the CIA's operational rehearsal notes, the ones written on encrypted embassy typewriters loaded into the compromised communication system. When Harper walked into the metro station, the KGB had already deployed a full shadow team. Not the clumsy, overt tail units used to intimidate diplomats. This was a surgical group, elite officers from the 7th Directorate trained specifically to intercept CIA operations without leaving traceable signatures. As Harper changed metro lines, the KGB officers rotated positions with machine-like precision. One stepped off the train, another stepped on. A woman in a dark coat adjusted her scarf to signal the next operative. A janitor sweeping the station floor pressed a concealed clicker, marking Harper's position. Harper noticed nothing. At Sokolniki Park, the temperature had dropped to 14 degree. The snow muffled every sound. Harper moved quickly, following the protocol, unaware he was walking into a controlled perimeter. When he reached the birch tree and placed the capsule inside, he felt the slightest vibration on the snow behind him. A footstep, soft and deliberate. He turned. Two men stood there. No uniforms, no guns visible, no words. The men stepped aside, as if allowing him to leave. A psychological tactic the KGB perfected to terrify CA operatives. It meant, "We see you. We can take you whenever we want." Harper returned to the embassy shaken. He insisted he had not been followed, but Fulton, after listening to the tremor in his voice, realized the truth. The KGB had turned the entire mission into theater. The next morning, the capsule was gone. The KGB had not only intercepted the decoy, they had done so with such precision that it left no doubt. The CIA's operational map of Moscow was fully compromised. Now Langley understood the full scale of their failure. Operation Cleanliness was not the KGB's victory. It was only their opening move. Another, deeper penetration, one that would shake the CIA to its core, was about to be revealed. In March 1981, just weeks after the ambush of Operation Midnight Sun, a courier from the U.S. Air Force Intelligence Service landed in Moscow carrying a sealed diplomatic pouch. Inside were new encryption rotors, fresh typewriter components, and a letter marked "Urgent, eyes only for the chief of station." Fulton opened it in silence. The contents confirmed the one fear he had hoped would never be true. The KGB had not merely breached the embassy. They had penetrated the CIA's global encryption supply chain. Evidence had surfaced in Germany. A shipment of secure Selectric II typewriters destined for U.S. embassies showed microscopic signs of tampering, tiny metallic anomalies, too small to be seen without magnification. Further inspection revealed the truth. Each machine contained a device that recorded keystrokes through electromagnetic induction. This was a precursor to what the NSA would later call the Kremlin field effect. It meant that every classified message typed in the Moscow embassy, and possibly dozens of others, had been silently copied and transmitted to Soviet listening posts. Worse still, the components inside the machines matched the same signature as the bug found beneath the embassy. It was the same KGB team, the same operation, the same long-term strategy. Washington had no choice. They ordered the complete shutdown of all CIA operations in Moscow. Every asset, every informant, every field officer was grounded. Some were evacuated, others were abandoned, and some, the ones the CIA had never identified, simply disappeared into the Soviet system with no trace. Inside Lubyanka, Colonel Chernyakovsky wrote the final report on Operation Cleanliness. The Americans suspected a breach, but not the scope. Their failure was not technological, it was psychological. They believed we would not think long-term, but the KGB had thought long-term. They had built their victory over years, inch by inch, quietly adjusting cables, tampering with machines, and infiltrating supply networks. They didn't need luck. They needed patience. The CIA's after-action review, known later as the Snowfield Report, was brutal. It concluded that the agency had ignored early warnings, underestimated Soviet expertise, and relied too heavily on aging encryption systems. The loss of Ulysses became a case study in what happens when intelligence agencies fall behind their adversaries, not in strength, but in imagination. Some details remained classified for decades. Others surfaced slowly. A CIA safe house in Zelenograd had been compromised years earlier. 3 embassy employees were later suspected of feeding logistical details to the KGB. At least 4 American assets vanished between 1980 and 1982, all likely linked to data intercepted through the embassy breach. But the most chilling revelation came in 1992, after the fall of the Soviet Union. A former KGB engineer, speaking anonymously to researchers, revealed that Operation Cleanliness had one final component the CIA never discovered: a continuous archive of intercepted embassy communications stored deep beneath Lubyanka, over 6 years' worth. Every cable, every message, every keystroke. A complete shadow archive of American intelligence activities in the USSR. For the CIA, it was a humiliation so severe that internal memos avoided even using the codename. It was simply referred to as the Moscow failure. And to this day, historians agree on one point. The CIA did not lose because they learned the KGB's plan too late. They lost because the KGB had written the ending long before the Americans even realized the story had begun. The mission was not merely failed. It was over before the CIA ever knew it had started.